in progress.
Well, good evening to everyone joining us. It's great to see you all coming here tonight. We'll just give it a couple of minutes while you all sign in. And I recognize some of the names already, which is brilliant. And I know that you're tuning in from all over the UK, but also all over the world. So that's great. Hi, Jeanette. So it's really, really nice that we get such a broad audience coming to our talks, which I suppose segues neatly into me sort of giving the gentle reminder that, you know, we provide these talks for free, but it's only through your support of the society that we can continue to do so. So if for some strange reason you happen not to be a member, please do consider joining us. You can find details on our website. And of course, it's not just things like these monthly talks that we do. We've got a conference coming up in Liverpool. And also we have our journal and grants and stuff like that. So please check that out and consider joining us. Before I introduce our speaker, just a reminder as well that if you have questions for him, which I'm sure you will, just pop them into the chat box at any point during the talk. And at the end, Rob will sort of select the questions and put them to our speaker. So think about intriguing, probing, difficult things to ask our speaker or anything. No question is too silly or too obvious. Sometimes it's the obvious questions actually can be the hardest ones to answer from experience. So not that I'm suggesting we give our speaker a hard time. Anyway, I'm going to move on because I've got myself into a slight corner with that one. I'll move on and introduce our speaker because it's him who you want to hear from, not me. Tonight we have Kevin Cootes, who is a senior research officer at Liverpool John Moores University. And he's also the consultant archaeologist for the Poulton research project. And for those of you who have not heard of the Poulton project, it's, I can't actually remember how long running it is, but it's been going for a very long time, very wide-ranging landscape project with many facets to it. But tonight our speaker Kevin is going to talk to us about one aspect of that project, which is the medieval chapel burial ground at Poulton. So I will hand over to him and he's going to tell us all about it. Over to you, Kevin.
Great, thank you, Hugh. Thank you, it's good to see you again as always. Right, first things first. Of course, no stupid questions apart from who my hairdresser is. I do draw the line at that one. So I'm going to share screen, if that's okay. Let me just see how I can do that again. So share screen. Okay, is that coming through?
Yep, that's up there.
That's brilliant. So if I do slideshow, so slideshow from beginning. So I take it you can all see me now.
That's good, yep.
I'm just going to minimize a couple of things and I'm just going to go back. So I hope it's all right for me to start.
Of course, yeah.
That's great, thank you. Right, everyone, it's a real pleasure to present to you this evening Church Archaeology. And I'm actually calling you from Cork in Southern Ireland, where I'm currently doing the first time ever, assisting on, just as a digger in this case, assisting as on a cave excavation. I thought change is as good as the rest, but I get to talk to you while I'm here about basically the love of my life, the Poulton Research Project, and more specifically, the medieval ecclesiastical remains. And Poulton has been going since 1995. That's when we first started as a research project. And it's the first ever place that I put a trowel in the ground way back in 2001. And I know I don't look old enough to, of course, been digging since 2001, but I have indeed. So this is a place that's very close to my heart. I came back home to Poulton to be consultant archaeologist in 2013, and I've stayed ever since. And what you're going to hear about today is the medieval remains. And what I'm going to give you is very, very brief to what we really have, not just for the medieval period, but for the entire landscape, because we investigate an archaeological landscape with over 11,000 years of material culture and basically structural remains from the Iron Age through to the Roman and the early medieval. I do get told off when I say Saxon period, but the early medieval and into what I would call the classic medieval or later medieval period, where the site is eventually abandoned in the late 17th, early 18th centuries. But I'm going to talk to you about one part of it, the excavation of a rural medieval chapel and secular graveyard, and also things that are involved in it and the reasons why we first came to Poulton. So to give you a bit of background on the site, if I can make this PowerPoint work. There we go. Poulton itself, Poulton in Cheshire. There are lots of Poultons all over the place. One of the big problems I have is trying to find which Poulton my students have gone to on the first day of their dig, but thankfully now with SatNav, they usually all make it pretty much into the right place. But Poulton, if you can see my my cursor here, is located as a small rural village, basically in Cheshire, classic medieval rural village in Cheshire. It is 5 miles south of the legionary fortress and city at Chester on the English and Welsh border. So if you look over here, this is actually the surviving settlement, small farming settlement, no shops, no post office. It's just basically a few farms and some barn conversions for really rich people. And it's basically on the border of England and Wales. But the landscape itself is actually very interesting. There's about 1,200 acres of land that actually belong to Poulton. And it's in a really, really interesting place, which is incredibly important for all periods, but also for the ecclesiastical remains. So we're in the northwest of England, the other side of the Pennines to Sheffield, if you're listening in from Sheffield. And we are basically in a rural agricultural field on the eastern limits of Poulton. And it's this field, let me just get my cursor here, the 55 acres of Chapel Field. Bit of a giveaway as to what we're going to find. We are actually at the southern end of a RAF airfield, which is again another element of the archaeological landscape. And this is in the private ownership of Mr. Richard Fair, who is the landowner and head of the trust and in many ways sponsor of our site. And to the north on the actual World War II airfield actually belongs to the Duke of Westminster, to the state, Lord Grosvenor. So Chapel Field, before we even go into the ecclesiastical remains, I always give a talk about the landscape and why it's so important. And this is important for our monastic landscape as well, because we are right next to the River Dee. And the River Dee, I often say, is the motorways of history and prehistory. Easier to get up the rivers and down than it was to cross the land until relatively recently. It's also your site of fresh water, all the plants and animals that grow around, all the plants that grow around it, and the animals that water or live there that you can utilize for food, medicines, hunting, pelts, that kind of thing. So we're right next to the River Dee, but we are also, Poulton itself, Chapel Field, is in a spare in the landscape, basically the high ground overlooking the floodplain of the River Dee and Old Pulford Brook. Here it is here. And the Old Pulford Brook feeds into the River Dee. It is the historic boundary of England and Wales. So here is England, where we excavate Chapel Field, and just over the other side of the brook is Wales. And just by looking at this brook, we can see basically medieval monastic water engineering. This bend in the brook here is not original. It's not its natural water course. That's the giveaway. The original course of it was down here. It's been channeled. Also, there's an artificial island now of a woodland on it that may have been a medieval water mill. And this rectangular field, as you'll see in a minute, actually, it doesn't have it on the map, but there are 4 medieval fish ponds arranged in a rectangle. So this is classic medieval monastic water engineering that we'll come to. So this is a pretty ideal site. What's also good about the site, we'll come to shortly, but why do I say monastic? Why do I say it's been engineered? Well, we've got to go way back to 1962 to where the story starts with Mr. Jerry Fair, the father of the current landowner, Mr. Richard Fair. And he made a discovery that we'll see shortly. But historic monument, historic records attest to there being a lost abbey of the Cistercian order of monks. Can I just say, it is not the abbey you're looking at now. That's just another Cistercian abbey, but because it wouldn't have been lost for very long. But we have plenty of records of a Cistercian abbey at Poulton. Now, for any of you who don't know the Cistercians, they were formed in 1098, and they came as a kind of rejection to the Benedictine order of monks. And the way I look at the Benedictines is, Friar Tuck is a classic. They'd got lazy, they'd got they were eating too much, drinking too much, doing all the sinful things in the cities. And the Cistercians wanted to get away from that and live the life that St. Benedict had actually laid out back in the 4th, 5th century. Became the Cistercian monks. They rejected it. They wanted to be out in the wilderness. And also, just in case, it says my internet connection is unstable. If anything happens, I will come straight back on, okay? So anyway, the Cistercians rejected the Benedictine way of life. They wanted to get back to the rule of St. Benedict. And there was a massive expansion in basically the 12th century of the Cistercians. They wanted to tame wild places where they could channel water. So during the anarchy, if you still call it the anarchy, I've been told off for that as well. Apparently it's a supposed anarchy now. The anarchy, the reigns of Stephen and Matilda, is a great time of expansion for the Cistercians, because they didn't cost much to actually give them land, not compared to other monastic orders. You could give them an area that was wild and untamed, and they would tame it in a few years. So they had a massive expansion in the 12th century. And this expansion included the incorporation of the Savignac order, and there really were literally many, many Cistercian monasteries, possibly in the hundreds if I can't quite remember my numbers, but there was a massive expansion in the 12th century. And we do have records that the Cistercian abbey was founded at Poulton, because during the anarchy of Stephen and Matilda, Earl Ranulph II of Chester was actually loyal to Empress Matilda, and he was captured by King Stephen's forces in Lincoln. And what happened was, half the land at Poulton was given for the monks to found an abbey to pray for his safe return. Now, this is between 1147 and 1158, because Poulton was a daughter house of Cumbermere, and Cumbermere Abbey in Cheshire was converted from the Savignac order. So sometime in that 11-year bracket, they actually founded a Cistercian abbey at Poulton. But the abbey only lasted for about 60 years. We do know that they became the 3rd richest landowner in Cheshire very, very quickly. But they were fed up with raiding from the Welsh. The Welsh were raiding from the neighbouring kingdom of Gwynedd, literally just over the Pulford Brook. So they were only there for 60 years. And in 1214, they signed a charter to relocate the abbey at Dewlacray in Staffordshire, near modern-day Leek. So we do know they signed the charter to leave in 1214, and in AD 1220, they laid the foundation stone at Dewlacray. So that only gave them about 60 years. So we know there was an abbey at Poulton, and we know it's lost. But an kind of like neonatal abbey in its initial form is something that will be pretty unique to find. So we know that there was a missing Cistercian abbey, which was probably only partially constructed when the monks decided to leave. And this is actually from the Time Team episode, The Abbey Habit. The grandson of Earl Ranulph II had a dream, and that dream told him to move the abbey, my son. You must take it to Dewlacray, go and move it there, make it this size, make it, basically this size, this shape. And like a good Christian man, he left. But they also got offered a lot of money, and they couldn't wait to get away from the Welsh. So they left, but they kept the actual land as part of their portfolio until the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII. So let's have a look at actually the land itself. This is an aerial, a drone photo of Chapel Field. We've got a few of them to go through, but majorly you can see the diversion of the old Pulford Brook. The woodland here marks the artificial island, and this is one of the four fish ponds which are laid out in a rectangle with dividing banks between them. Now, Chapel Field is actually right above the floodplain. So this is classic Cheshire boulder clay. I know it's called glacial till, but there's actually common name is boulder clay. And boulder clay is very, very good for grasslands, but very poor until modern agricultural techniques for growing crops. But the Poulton Brook itself the floodplain of the River Dee adds a little bit of an extra way of basically growing food. This is another picture of it here. And this is looking from the other direction. Here are excavations. And this is the bend in the old Poulton Brook. The plateau is actually south facing as well. So it's really good, so it gives you maximum sunlight. But although the plateau is quite severe, to the eastern side, there's a gentler drop down to the River Dee. So here's the River Dee itself. So it's also good for beaching boats, for water, for kind of water trade, for water resources, trading up and down the river, and for contact. And this is what the floodplain looks like after it floods. And a lot of it is actually still a triple SI, because it's one of the few in the region surviving floodplains which are intact. But when the actual water retreats, there's another picture of the floodplain, when the water retreats, it leaves behind nutrient-rich silts, which are really, really good for agriculture. Now, this is what the floodplain looks like after it floods. You can see just about here, the bend in the Poulton Brook. This is Chapel Field. And here are the fish ponds, and there's the artificial island. So it does flood to about 10 or 15 feet at its worst at the moment. But how it flooded in the medieval period is a completely another thing, because the area would have been much more wooded. We also have global warming, so the floods may not have been as severe. The earliest map we have is the Eton Estate mid-17th century estate map. And we do have other maps that later reveal a lot about the landscape, but it does reveal a lot about the monastic landscape at the time. We already have the water engineering. We already have the fish ponds. There's the water engineering there. But what we also have is the site of Poulton Chapel. You can see it just there. And also later on, look at this boundary. And Chapel Field is actually 4 different fields: Fairvest Chapel Field, Great Chapel Field, Little Chapel Field, and Chapel Field next to the house. There's also a Poulton Hall. This has been proved by excavation to be the site of the actual original monastic grange. So the grange itself was later converted in the early post-medieval period into Poulton Hall, when the Manleys, who you'll find about later, took over the land. Little thing here as well. This is Great Pavement Hay. I know it's not the period, but pavement often refers to some kind of tessellated floor, hard surface being found, and quite often refers to the siting of a Roman villa of some kind, or a Roman road, which is something else which is incredibly interesting. Unfortunately, it's underneath a World War II airfield. But you can see here 4 fields, all referring to the chapel. Now, we hope that the chapel would be a capella ad portam, or chapel next to the gate, which can either be physical, as in chapel next to the gate of the Cistercian Abbey, or metaphorical, meaning it's outside, but it's not quite next to it. And that's where basically the common people could come and worship. So this is the actual structure that started our excavations way back in 1995. Because in 1962, Mr. Jerry Fair actually took over this land. He took over the land, started to rent it, and then later bought Chapel Field. And he took out those field boundaries, but he had this map and he could see the remains, just little bits of sandstone poking out of the ground. So he came over, literally could see the remains of the chapel, there's sandstone, broken sandstone in the actual chapel, in the ground itself. And he did a dig, little more than a hole in the ground. But he found a glazed medieval floor tile. It was actually this one or this one, I can never remember which one. A glazed medieval floor tile and possibly a human mandible. Now, where I come from, Birkenhead, that is cause for the police. But here, it was pretty obvious that he had found a rural ecclesiastical site, not least because it was on a map. And it was more forgotten about than actually lost. He took in his finds to Grosvenor Museum, and he tried to get interested in excavation. But that interest didn't come until 1995. And he just ploughed the field immediately to the east of the chapel. And the archaeologists came out 20 minutes late as usual on a very, very, blizzardy morning, about March or April. And they were fed up until they got to that ploughing. And they found pottery, tiles, human bone, all types of material in that actual plough soil, and they were fascinated. So we came and we started an excavation at Poulton, which morphed from a university and Chester museum dig into a community-based research and teaching project, where people from all different walks of life are given the opportunity to excavate basically first-class archaeology, to have access to a site that you wouldn't usually have access to, and to receive training. We've inspired a lot of careers from Poulton, including my own. So he found this tile. So what happened is we came out and did an excavation, and that excavation started on Poulton Chapel, and that's remained one of the main focuses, Trench 1. And this is Poulton Chapel in its early years, what it looked like back in the late 1990s, when we were just beginning what would be an extensive excavated. We've revealed the actual edge of the structure, the foundation stones. You can see it here, an aerial photograph. And we got a lot of information about this, not just from archaeology, from excavations, but historically. This is an image of actually Poulton Chapel from the air. We've got a roundhouse because we've got an extensive Iron Age settlement. And just as a by-the-by, the medieval structure is actually on the site of Roman activity. So there's probably continuity in activity and possibly structure spanning at least the 1st century AD, possibly very much earlier, because we have Iron Age finds on a chapel, Roman finds, 10th century Saxon pottery called Chesterware, but more commonly known as Staffordware. Now we know it was made in Stafford. So quite often when we've excavated our burials, we find Roman features underneath them. But that's not the focus of this talk. The focus of this talk is our excavations of the chapel primarily. So here are the foundations of the chapel, with tower here, entrance to the tower, nave, and chancel at the east end. And here is actually an aerial photograph of it, directly above. Now, we've got another slide shortly, which will give us the timeline of the chapel from what we know from historical records. But I'll just give a little bit away. The abbey leaves in 1214, where they sign the foundation charter to go to Dewlacre, and they lay the foundation stone in 1220. But the first mention of the chapel is AD 1250. And we know it was expanded in the 15th century, when we'll talk shortly about that, but it becomes a private chapel for a gentleman called Sir John Manley, who leases all of Poulton off the monks. Now, it was originally a single cell structure, and this is the single cell structure here. Now, the reason I know that is because this is the back wall of the structure, and this is one of its buttresses. This is actually the tower here. So when they demolished the tower in the late 15th century, after building, they left the foundations in to incorporate and strengthen the later structure. So this is the back wall of the tower, and its buttresses here from the 15th century, and this is the 13th century structure, and its buttresses here. What you're looking at here, just in case you're wondering, is a series of Roman period ditches, which actually were backfilled a millennia before, or 2 millennia before this chapel was built in this form. So it's very multi-phase, and it's more akin to an urban site on Trench 1 than a rural site. But let's just give a quick timeline. We talked about the Grange, and the first mention of the Grange is in AD 1201, during the life of the abbey at Poulton. And we know about the Grange from that period because the monks at Basingstoke, which is a sister abbey to Poulton, that's on the North Wales coast, not too far from Poulton, complained that the monks at Poulton were building the structure outside the statutes of the general chapter. Basically, they were building it too big, and the monks at Basingstoke were complaining. The reason we know, the reason we think they were building a Grange so late is because Time Team, if you watch the episode, found evidence of an extensive burning layer when they excavated Poulton Hall and the remains of the Grange that predated it. So it's possible that the Grange was built early on, burnt down, and because they were so prosperous, they were a bit cheeky and they decided to build it bigger. But the Cistercians had very strict rules on sizes for building things. We also know that the AD 1250, the first mention of the Chapel of St. Mary. And the Chapel of St. Mary, the Cistercians named their abbeys after Mary. So that's the next thing. So we first mentioned that. We have some records of the life of the actual chapel. In AD 1400, sorry if I'm pronouncing this wrongly, because basically I am Welsh by parents, but my Welsh is terrible. Iwan Goff lay in wait to cause harm to Thomas Quayford. So whatever was going on there, we're not sure why, but he was not a happy bunny with Thomas. In AD 1543, the 16th of August, Dewlacre is actually dissolved. The abbey is actually dissolved at Dewlacre. But before that, in AD 1493, Sir John Manley leases the entirety of the land from the abbey at Dewlacre, and he leases all of it. All of the lands are leased. The Cistercians aren't doing well by this time. Basically, it was far easier for them to lease the whole land and to get some kind of monetary recompense. And also there was clauses where they were allowed to visit twice a year. They got more than just money, but they leased the land to them. So in AD 1543, the abbey is actually dissolved. And the land then goes into the ownership of not just the Manley family, but also the Grosvenors. The Grosvenors are part of this land by now, so the Grosvenors take over part of the land as well. So it becomes basically owned, the actual land, by the Manley family, by the Grosvenors, but eventually the Grosvenors take over all the land. And of course, they build Eaton Hall, which is just over a mile away from where our site is. So this site becomes, rather than, it started off as a monastic site, then it becomes a rural site for the actual abbey, but then it becomes a rural site for the Duke of Westminster, who lives over a mile away, so it becomes part of the Eaton estate. We think the last probable use of this chapel was during the English Civil War. In 1646, 3 weeks before the end of that period of Civil War, Chester is Pulford Green, which is the area where the road is now, is ordered by parliamentarian forces to be manned because they wanted to keep an eye on the royalists at Holt. Now, it would have been quite silly for them not to utilize Poulton Chapel. It would have been a great lookout post, a place to either put troops in, or to billet troops, or to even put horses in. But it seems to be at this period it's pretty much trashed. This is the last evidence of occupation we get. Material from that time, musket balls, pottery from that time. And we know that in 1672, Sir Peter Leicester recorded the chapel as being in ruins, and in AD 1719 they send Bishop Gastrell from Chester to see if there's any taxes owed, and he says there is no more to be seen. So that's what we know of the actual monastic and ecclesiastical history of Poulton itself. We also know that when the monks left, they did leave behind some monks to look after the land, and some monks are priests, so they left them behind to minister as well to the flock. Now, we have plenty of archaeological information from this time. I'm going to show you a few pictures of finds, but please be aware you're going to see lots of pictures of human remains in skeletal form, okay? So if you don't like that bit, that's going to be the rest of this talk. So our investigations have allowed us to look at this chapel and graveyard and the wider landscape in detail, and to investigate it bit by bit by bit. We've got lots of different designs of floor tile, and we have an excellent, retired but excellent medieval specialist, Janet Axworthy, who's done a lot of work on our floor tiles, and most of them are the kind of variations and the designs that you get in the Cheshire region, and the Cheshire region in Chester. Some of our designs, you'll see them in St. John's in Chester, and you'll see them in the Abbey of St. Werburgh's, what Chester Cathedral now, but was originally the Abbey of St. Werburgh's. And we have enough information from them to know that they were made on site. We've got too many near unusable seconds. And also medieval tilers often traveled with their stamps, but they would actually set up the kiln, use the local clays, and make the tiles on site. So we know that they were made near the site, even though we haven't got the kilns yet. But you can see there's lots of different tiles here with multiple designs, and they form repeating patterns. Here is one of the repeating patterns. So you look at it by itself, it's not too great, that one there, but you can see the design to make repeating patterns. So we know lots about the floor tiles, and we have lots of pottery from the time as well, which does span the historical period that we know Poulton existed. But when we came to excavate the graveyard, and that's where we're going to go from here, we found that there was almost perfect preservation of human remains in skeletal form. And these are classic medieval burials. Now, the first thing to understand is these are not the monks. These are the farmers and their families who basically worked the land for the monks. After the monks left, when they were still in charge of the land, they worked the land, and they lived in a scattered village around Poulton, in a scattered settlement. And these are classic medieval burials. The head is on, well, basically they lay on their back with the head at the west end and their feet at the east end. So on the day of judgment, they rise to face Jesus coming back from Jerusalem. And these are very, very classic medieval burials. I mean, most of the medieval burials that we see, if we're not archaeologists, are going to be in cathedrals and abbeys, and it's the rich people, the bishops, the kings, the nobles. The vast majority of people were buried very simply in shallow graves with very, little or usually no grave goods, with their heads at the waist end and their feet at the east end. And this is something that we have investigated this graveyard systematically since our first year of excavation in 1996. And we excavate under government license with nothing but the greatest respect for the fact that we are excavating human remains. We never forget that we're dealing with people. And we train students, the next generation of forensic anthropologists, archaeologists, we've trained police, we've even trained war grave diggers who've gone on to take the skills that we actually provide to, into their careers. And that's because this is the closest you will get to a modern murder, because I often like to freak my students out in this bit. But what happens is, if you hear buried in a shallow grave next to a road on the news, I automatically know that the person who'd committed that murder probably didn't plan it, did it in the heat of the moment. And most murders are in the heat of the moment. And if they're buried next to a shallow grave, I am not telling you how to get away with murder, but it's because they didn't go out with the right tools for the job. Because these graves are shallow, and it's very easy to get through the topsoil and the subsoil. But when you hit the parent geology, whether that might be clay or limestone, gravel, chalk, whatever, it's compacted. It's been there for thousands, if not tens or hundreds of thousands of years. And you need really big, proper purposeful tools like a mattock or a pickaxe to get through that. So that tells me automatically that it's a, it's a murder that was not thought or planned out. There's other ways that I'm not going to give you other hints, but that is because this is very similar to a modern murder. And Cheshire is not renowned for its survival of human remains, but that's because quite often the clays are mildly acidic. So quite often burials don't survive more than a couple of centuries. And I've excavated in other areas of Cheshire and North Wales, and quite often the bones are gone after a couple of hundred years. But we do have a band in Cheshire which incorporates Heron Bridge, which has a Saxon battle cemetery. And because of the Irish Sea tills, actually, last glaciation, bringing in crushed limestone, we call it marl, kind of crushed shell, into the field, it's given it an almost neutral geology, which is brilliant for preservation. So systematically, as a training school, we've studied this burial site for over 20 years. Just so you know, the majority of our skeletons, once excavated and recorded and excavated, are sent to Liverpool John Moores University, where I work as a senior research officer, and they are cleaned, catalogued as part of a team, stored, studied, used as teaching aids. They are studied for master's and PhD level and postdoc level. Other universities do with permission, do research on them. We've recently done a genetic study of 21 of the skeletons as part of the Crick Institute's whole genome study. And as much as I wish I could tell you what they found, I can't, because it's a PhD and she hasn't published yet, but she's found some amazing material stuff. And we've got lots of research and publications coming out about Poulton at the moment. But let's talk more about the graveyard. So here is a plan of the graveyard, and every dot represents a single burial. And you can see that they're buried in rows and that there's a lot of them. We actually have a minimum number of individuals of 800 burials at the moment. It's spot on 800. And that's the minimum number. We'll explain why in a second. But maybe about 3-4 centuries over the later medieval period. And each one of these dots forms a burial. Now, the major thing is, this is the population of the village, but we call it the graveyard population. It's not the same, although it's very closely linked. It's very slightly different than the population of the village. The major thing is, this is a Catholic burial ground, and not everyone from that village made it in. So if you were an unbaptized baby, if you were a suicide, a murderer, a stranger, you would not be buried in the graveyard. So although these are the people you're about to see of the village itself over several centuries, they are not everybody from that village made it in. So you can see here that they're buried in rows, and they're buried in simple earth-cut graves without any form of permanent marker. There's no evidence of crucifixes, there's no evidence of crosses, there's no evidence of gravestones. And this is again the classic burial pattern for the majority of the medieval population. Now, what do our radiocarbon dates say about the chapel's usage? Because this is going to be very important later on when we talk about the abbey. And that's only at the end. Most of this is going to be here. So we had, up until the last couple of years, 6 radiocarbon dates. And they span, if you take a look here, they span the 14th to the late 16th century AD. And that kind of works. That works with what we know about the record, about the historical record. But when we did the 21 skeletons that were sampled for the Crick Institute, they asked me for the earliest and latest. I can't tell you why, because it's their research and I can't give away their research and results before they do. But they wanted the earliest and the latest from the actual chapel graveyard from right the way across it. So I did choose that, but I also chose double burials as well, because I wanted to know, once they told me certain information, in the double and group burials, I wanted to know, are they related? Are they related? The people in there, are they related to each other? If they're in a double burial or a treble grave? And also, I wanted to know, let me refine the radiocarbon dates. So these 21 dates, these are all the 21 dates we have. I don't expect you to read all of them, but these are the Bayesian modeled radiocarbon dates. So what I can actually tell you is that the earliest burial within inside the chapel itself that we sampled dates to the next generation after the abbey left. So 1220 to 1270 is our earliest radiocarbon date. And 27 radiocarbon dates for a graveyard is actually quite good. I would have rather we had 80 to represent 10% of it, but that would have cost us way too much. But we have lots of historical data, lots of stratigraphic data. I chose the earliest and the latest, and it shows the earliest burial is actually after the abbey leaves. And the latest burials go up to the 15th and 16th centuries. So it's exactly what we'd expect. The majority of our burials span the 14th century, funnily enough, 14th into 15th century. So there's a high period of when the graveyard is being used. It seems to drop off a bit when the Manley family take over, they expand the burial ground, and it becomes their own private chapel and burial ground. So you've probably got 2 populations here. The population of the village who were buried there for at least 2.5 centuries, and then the later population of the Manleys when they came in, and it's a private burial ground for the extended Manley family. But the analysis of this burial ground has given us a very unique picture of burial types, burial trends, of health, of hygiene, of the kind of accidents and the kind of wear that people would have, and also in the minor variations in death. Because please remember, not only are these human beings, but the dead do not bury themselves. they are buried by the people they love. And many of us will be old enough to remember to have now buried somebody close to us. When that happens, you were given a small casket with soil to sprinkle in on top of the coffin when you bury someone close to you, to basically as a reference to when it would have been your job to bury your own dead, the people close to you. And this is a small village. Everyone will have known everyone. So let me give you a few of the trends, and only just basically a sampler of the work we've done and the research we're doing. We have lots and lots of double and multiple burials, such as these skeletons 691 and 692. Actually, I know a lot about these that I can't tell you, unfortunately, because they are part of the Crick Institute study. But next time when we get all the information out, I'm happy to come back and tell you again. But you can see how good the preservation is. So we have double burials, multiple burials. We have differential preservation, which is incredibly interesting. And you can see how shallow many of these burials are. On the southern end, the southern side of the graveyard, there's actually a hedge, a 19th century hedge. And that hedge has often caused quite a lot of damage to the burials through biotubation. But in the northern graveyard, we often get much better surviving skeletons. So the one on the right is in the northern graveyard, the one on the left is in the southern graveyard. So there's quite differential differences in survival due to the processes, due to the natural process of biotubation or taphonomic processes. The graveyard can have some terrible, not terrible is the wrong word, can have some very poorly surviving remains. And this can be for many different reasons, of which biotubation is just one of them. But on the left-hand side, you are looking at a small child. Now, one thing I would like to put forward is I'm not an osteologist. I'm not a forensic anthropologist. I'm a field archaeologist and pottery specialist and commercial archaeologist. But teaching a graveyard excavation, which I can do because that's what I do for a living, you pick up a hell of a lot about skeletons. So I do have more than your general archaeologist knowledge of human remains, but I would not claim to be an expert in them. I'm an expert in how to train you to excavate and record them. And then when we take them off to Liverpool John Moores University, it is the experts who do the teaching and the analysis. I look after the skeletons. They do all of the lab stuff. But this is a young baby, maybe 0 to 1 years old, I'm not sure. And this is on the southern graveyard as well. And you can see how poorly it's preserved. You also get, this is a juvenile subadult, and that's also biotubation has caused a problem, but also compaction of the bones. The bones are often broken because, not just in juveniles, but in adults as well, but also in juveniles, but primarily in juveniles, the bones are a lot thinner. There's no flesh anymore to hold them together. There's no brain inside the actual cranial cavity. And it's the weight of the earth and anything above it crushes the bones. So you quite often get breakages across weak points. The mid-center shafts of the arms and legs, so the arm bones and leg bones, often gets cracked and broken. I don't know if you can see it, but there's one there. You'll see plenty more. The ribs often get broken, and the cranium often gets compacted. This is just a taphonomic processes, post-burial processes, post-mortem processes. Sorry, I can't quite see. This is just to show you differential preservation again in the northern graveyard, but it also goes on to show you what my next couple of slides will be about. We have lots and lots of intercutting burials. And I'm going to make this point now because we've got a great one. Example, in these 3 skeletons, they look quite random, and they look random because of the way we excavate them. We can't expose all of the rows, but they were buried in rows, in shallow graves from north to south. You saw that in that little plan we had before, where the dots represented the burials. And once that they were complete, once a grave row was complete, they would go back and start a new row, often intercutting and cutting through earlier burials. And that would mean that we only have, many of our burials are only partially surviving. So these 3 burials are actually 3 rows. And this is the earliest one, this adult. This adult was buried, and then a row was actually completed eventually. And then the second burial in the sequence is this one of this child, the subadult. And you can see what juvenile by the look of it. This burial cut into the earlier one. But the last one in this sequence, so this is actually representing 3 rows, cuts into the middle one and the earlier one. And this is great for stratigraphic referencing, for stratigraphic analysis. if I want to radiocarbon date these few, which I haven't, I could get one from each. And that's great. Radiocarbon date for each, great for Bayesian modeling. Although I don't know the time difference between them just by looking at this, I do know earliest, middle, latest, and you can refine the radiocarbon dates with enough information to provide a more refined radiocarbon date. That's why some of our carbon dates are down to 20 years, are really good. Our taphonomic processes do move the bones quite severely. And you can see here, this child, this quite small juvenile, has had some quite severe displacement of the femurs, the upper legs. So the pelvis is gone. These are post-burial taphonomic reasons. Sometimes it's due to the biotubation of roots, but it can also be animal burrowing and so forth. And this one has had some quite serious movement of the lower legs, you can see here, and also the left femur. And sometimes they're actually quite subtle. And this one here exemplifies how to be careful about analyzing your skeletons and getting good record photographs. Because several of our double burials have the arms crossed and look like they're actually holding hands, but they're not, because on a close-up of this will show you that this arm is too small for them to be holding hands. You've had post-burial movement of the bones, which has made it look like the arms are crossed, and it's just the post-burial movements themselves. From the picture we had before of the baby burial as well, babies are quite often buried higher, a higher level than adults and older children, which means that the bones are more likely to be damaged or even lost. Quite often burials, rummaging animals, later burials can easily dig out an entire child, which is why our minimum number is not a true reflection. It's just a bare minimum that we have in there. We record all of our stratified material, all of our partially articulating bones. And for one burial, all it takes is 2 bones to articulate. We class it as a burial, but we get lots of loose, jumbled up bone that's been dug out and thrown back in. Now, we can't class that as a burial because it's not going to be a burial, it's just loose bone. And we don't want to give any of them skeleton numbers because you might have half of the burial still intact somewhere else or part of it. So it's quite difficult at times, but you can see there's lots of different forces that can affect how bones are preserved and how they're even moved and how we find them. They didn't mind, back in the medieval period, it was common to have intercutting burials like this. They believed that God reassembled you on a day of judgment. Now, sometimes though, our preservation can be absolutely amazing, such as this burial here, which was buried in a shroud. You'll see shortly how I know that. But the grave that was dug for this individual was almost totally the right size for the burial. So the feet have actually, the feet bones stayed in position when the body rotted. So that's the only example we've had of that. Usually the feet drop down. We do have, apart from truncation in the medieval period, we do have 19th century truncation as well. This is a row of burials, some of them intercutting, so there's actually 2 rows here. But in the 19th century, to improve the clay land for agriculture, with agricultural improvements, and this is something you find all across clay landscapes, a massive crisscross of drains were put in to drain the land because it's not very good. Clay is not very good because it holds water. So it wasn't great. They did farm them, they did do agriculture, but they wanted to improve it. So this is the only case we have in the chapel of a clay pipe. Now, these were farm workers, they had to do it, they had no choice. But just out of shot, they actually realized what they were doing in the 19th century. Don't forget, there's no sign of a chapel there, and apart from maybe a few bits of stone. And they actually picked out all the bones and put them back in on top of the pipe. So, they did show reverence. They had a job to do. It's just the way the cookie crumbles. Now, our truncation of burials. These are a few more examples of medieval truncation. And you can see that sometimes what we class as a stratified burial is just feet. That's all that's left of this individual. But the feet articulate, so it's a burial to us. This one here is skeleton 962. And what you have here is you have a quite extensively articulated burial. The arms across, look at the arms, the way the bones are broken over the weak points you see there. But we're just revealing another burial. Little nice important point. If it's a Christian burial in a shallow grave and it's intact, even with cranial compaction, the first thing you should come across is the top of the head here, because that's the highest point when you're lying on your back. So this one is actually cut by a later burial. This actually turned out to be near complete. And here's another burial which is truncated at the, from the top half. Just in case you've noticed this, skeleton 876 and 962 is way above 800 minimum number of individuals. I won't go into the past, but in the past, before my time, redeposited skulls were counted as burials, which erroneously overinflates the minimum number. So I've removed all redeposited skulls, and in the very early years, they would give numbers to scatters of bones. So I've had to remove all the ones that aren't articulated to come out with the minimum number of 800. That took me about 3 weeks to do. Now, here's another view of intercutting burials. And you can see here, we have the later in the sequence. There's some redeposited bone there, but this burial cuts through this burial. And these redeposited bones actually may have belonged to this individual at one time. We'll have a look at these. This one is done in 2017. And these were sent off to the Crick Institute as well, funnily enough. And I wish I could give you the information because it's fascinating, but I can't. But I'm hoping we will get multiple publications out of it in the future. This mature individual here, skeleton 913, cuts through a double burial of two children. So you can see the truncation that's going on there. Now, quite often the bones are thrown back in randomly, but every now and again, you actually get signs that they did actually pay a little bit of care. You can see the hedge behind you, so in the southern graveyard. This is the skull, has been placed carefully in the pelvis, and that pelvis itself has been redeposited and is complete. So that's quite interesting. The pelvis itself is complete. Maybe there was sinews or tendons still holding it together. But there was actually a treble burial under this. So we only excavated one there. You can see the arm of a child just coming out underneath it. And this is in the southern graveyard, which you're going to go into later. But this burial has actually been dug out and excavated out by the medieval grave diggers and then placed back in again with some care. It's just interesting to see it. Now, the type of burials, they're in shallow graves. Well, the majority were in shrouds, but some were in coffins. So since the coffins and the shrouds don't survive, how do we know what's coffin and what's shroud? Well, everyone would have been brought to the chapel in a coffin, but most were then taken out and buried in shrouds. And the reason we know is twofold. First off, if you're in a shroud, like this burial, your body's in tight when the earth surrounds you. So it pretty much stays in its position. There is some movement, but it stays more in the position as it rots. And there is also evidence, as a rule of thumb, that the shroud pushes the clavicles down like this. Now, in a coffin, although the coffin is rotted, the body rots quicker than the coffin, allowing the bones some form of movement. This burial looks like it's bow-legged, but it's not. The bones have popped out as it's decomposed within the coffin that still existed. But here's another thing. There's the right ilium there of the pelvis. Right. In 1 second, I'm going to run and get some water. I promise I'm not leaving for more than 30 seconds because I'm talking so much. I've got a bit of a dry cough. I'll be back in a second. Hold that point and look at that coffin nail there. After that brief interlude, the coffin nails survive, but the majority are shrouds. Now, we also get charnel pits, and you've probably heard of charnel houses, but charnel pits are skulls and long bones, because when they had to move burials for different reasons, but say in the late 15th century, you're extending your church from a single cell to a tripartite structure, they move burials. Now, if anyone here can tell me which pope it was who decreed it, I'd be very grateful. But the minimum required for successful resurrection were skulls and long bones. So we have quite a lot of small charnel pits that represent the movement of burials. Now, the southern graveyard shows favoured burial locations. We've had two of these features in the southern graveyard that we've interpreted as the foundations for the cross. And the burials around the cross, they seem to cluster. People want to be buried next to the cross. So the southern graveyard is actually a favoured area against like the northern graveyard, which is seen as the dark side, because basically the sun going around casts a shadow over the north. But where we usually have we have intercutting burials at roughly the same level. In the southern graveyard, we've got masses of intercutting burials, quite deep actually. And 6 feet under is only a 19th century thing. These are classic medieval burials. There were 6 feet under burials before then, but it's only standardized. These are classic shallow burials for the most part, but because of the sheer popularity of the southern graveyard, we get quite deep stratigraphy and we get lots of intercutting burials. So these are the legs from two child burials here. See? Now, they've been cut through by another burial which only exists as a leg there. And we're uncovering what turns out to be an extensively, if not completely articulated burial. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 individuals there. We have a redeposited bone there, and that's actually part of the, I've got to remember, the sacrum. So that's a sacrum, and that's been redeposited and thrown back in. But as we've explored this area more, it turns out we have multiple intercutting burials. By this time, we had taken out of this one area 15 burials before we got to this. So look at the individuals. You've got one there. See, child there. Another one there, that's 2. That's 3. That's 4. That's 5. That's 6. There's one over there for 7 and one over there for 8. And most of these have been excavated now. The only 2 that haven't are these ones, because you've got about 40 centimeters of ground there, 40, 45 centimeters of ground. We've reburied them because we've got to take the area back and we've got to take it down again. It's probably a double burial of adults, but there could be many above it. And you don't excavate out of sequence. You don't lift a earlier burial before a later burial. So we go back in time as the best we can. You can also see lots of jumbled up redeposited bones that you can throw back in. Now, there's that. Variations in body position is something that I'm doing as a statistical analysis over the summer, because I'm really looking forward to this. There's been some great studies that I'm going to use for statistical analysis. But burial positions, hand positions change. You can have by the sides, over the pelvis, over the stomach, even over the heart, like this, over the chest. So there's variations in body positions. And I want to find out, in our positions, what's going on. Is there any form of, kind of male to female, age related? Is there any trends we can see? You also have several reverse burials, which are buried west-east. And that might be one of 2 things. It could be a slight to the person where they weren't liked and they put them in the wrong way round, or it could be that they were rushed to get them in there because they were worried about what killed them would kill, them as well. So they were maybe something contagious and they just wanted them in. But in the shroud or a coffin, you should know the heavy end. So these may represent a slight to the individual. We also have unusual positions, which, can sometimes be attributed to post-burial movement of bones. And sometimes it's just like, I can't think of any post-burial movement, apart from the fact that this individual seems to be slightly on this side. So the grave cut is not exactly flat, but you can see the arms have moved. So it's over the right pelvis, right pelvis and the right femur. But this east-west is pretty much adhered to, but there's so many subtle differences, which with analysis, you can look at and you can do something to interpret burial practice and even belief with. And the next bits are more poignant because we have more still within East-West tradition, but more obvious variations, and they're almost always in children. Now, this is something that only occurs in the medieval period with children. So it seemed to be, basically a conscious choice of the people burying them. And that is variations in body position to mimic the sleeping position. This child here wasn't in a good condition, but you can see this child is bent and is kind of like curled up in a sleeping position with their arms underneath their head, as if it's attempted for innocence. We do have, even then, we have flexing of legs, different positions in legs and arms and the body, which will be part of the study in the summer. And then there's one very, very poignant one they came across that happened about 5 years ago. This is a plan of the chapel. Here's the hedge. This is the southern graveyard. And remember that on the southern graveyard, the other side, the land drops down quite severely. That's important. We found a burial here, like one I had never seen or ever heard of before, right on the edge of the graveyard before the land drops down. And that was a perinatal burial in the sleeping position. This child is about 5 weeks premature. There are the arms, there's the legs, sorry, the legs, the ribs, and you can just about see the arms here. Now, the cranium is compacted. Now, this is a child put on its right-hand side in the east-west position in the sleeping position. Now, although not common, it's known all across Christendom, basically across Western Christendom. It's a recognized variation. What was unique was this. This is the iron lock with copper alloy back repair of a box with a key, a locked box. Here is the corner bracket. And these bits here are actually nails, decorated nails. This baby was buried in a small wooden chest, not a coffin, a chest. Now, we block lifted it. We were in the process of block lifting. This took us 2.5 days to do it. It was the height of the summer. We couldn't wet it down too much because it was so dry and fragile, but we got it out. We got this child out intact and block lifted it. And we sent it for micro excavation and for X-raying and micro excavations of Durham University. Now, these are all the fragments. It actually went off to a vet's in Durham, believe it or not, because it was the only place they could X-ray the box, all wrapped up. And it did show a keyhole, a locking mechanism. So after micro excavation, this is the X-ray, and this is your lock. Here you can see the back plate there, and you can see the hooks for the lock, and you can see the iron plate. Then there's lots of bits to it, lots of nails. You can see that there's actually little stud, little decorations there, and there's the handle. Now, during micro excavation on the iron fragment, there was a small amount of oak found. Now, let me go back. Now, radiocarbon dates prove this baby to be buried between 1307 and 1421 AD. So this baby is buried in a small oak chest. This is a valuable item in the medieval period, especially to a peasant farmer. This is also a premature baby. Now, not only is it in a valuable box, and I've never heard of anything like it before, and you'll see shortly it's actually been published already, it also dates to the height of the graveyard's use, and it's a premature baby, and it's on the edge of the southern graveyard right before it drops down to the floodplain. Now, this is a Catholic burial ground run by the Cistercians, who are basically the hardcore of monks. Believe me, when the Pope wants monks to do something a bit harsh, he sends in the Cistercians. Unbaptized babies were not allowed to be buried in consecrated ground. I think it was Thomas Aquinas in the 4th century who taught they burn in hell. But by the medieval period, they'd become a bit more enlightened, and they said that the unbaptized child will not go to hell, but will not go to heaven either. They will be in limbus infantum, at the edge of hell. And what will happen is they will forever be there, and they couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. Quite often they were buried outside the graveyard. In Ireland, they were buried in specialist graveyards called Killeens. But we do know that clandestine burials happened of unbaptized babies, because we have it in the written record. In 1389, there were walls put around the church at Hereford. One of the reasons is to stop clandestine burials. So when you add all of this together, this baby was put into an ad hoc coffin, a coffin, or basically a box of high value. So the baby must have had more value than the actual box it was in. This is an older box, so it might even have been, a family heirloom. But because the baby was premature, because of its position in the graveyard, because of the time it was buried and the repository it was put in, if I was to sneak in an unbaptized baby under cover of darkness, I would do it from the southern end, from the floodplain, where I would actually be obscured from view. The only place you can get to the graveyard and still be obscured from view. So we've interpreted the combined evidence as a clandestine burial of an unbaptized baby. And that is very rare to get archaeologically, because how do you know if a perinate survived long enough to be christened? Because there was no such thing as baptism in utero. But if any part of the baby was showing, that could be baptized. If there wasn't a priest available, the midwife could do it. Anyone could do it. In fact, they used to have groups of people standing around saying the prayer, because what would happen, the prayer of baptism, is if the baby was then died, a priest would interview you. And if it was deemed wrong, baby couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. That's how important it was. There was something like miracle baptisms, because the rich always had a way around things, where they would put a feather on the baby's mouth and warm the baby, and then the feather would rise and say, look, it's breathing, and they'd baptize it. But for most people, it couldn't happen. But we know it happened historically, but it's very difficult to tell archaeologically, because you don't know if the baby survived long enough seconds to be christened. This is the one case where, because of its unusual nature and the combining evidence, it does, beyond reasonable doubt, seem to be a clandestine burial of an unbaptized baby. So you'll see the publication reference at the end. Anyway, violent deaths. We do have 5 skeletons of males with arrows or bodkins in their chest. This is the border of England and Wales. It is where, from Chester, basically Edward I, the other Edwards, the Henrys, are invading Wales. We're right on frontier territory. No sign of a major battle, but these are basically small raids, that kind of thing. And, an arrow at a wrong time. This gentleman, Arrow Man, ended up with a bodkin in his chest, which didn't damage his bones, so probably went up through his groin and basically killed him instantly. And just say, we do teach medieval archery to our students as well. Bernard the Archer comes along, and he's a medieval archery specialist in archery himself, and he gives a great talk, and they have a go of medieval bow and arrow. But I'm hoping that I'm not going on too long, and I hope I'm not boring you. But what about the research into life expectancy and the way these people lived? Well, from the actual graveyard population, you can see here, and this is due to be updated, but 50% of the population in Poulton were dead by the age of 18. It's probably a lot more than that, because, look at that, infant mortality should be around 10% at time of birth. So it's probably more likely 60% didn't make it to 18. 21% in this chart did not make it to 4, died by the age of 4. Now, how many of us would be alive today without modern medicine, pre and postnatal care, vaccines, proper diet? I would have died at the age of 2 from scarlet fever, or possibly at 17 from appendicitis. I definitely would not have reached my current age of 24. But anyway, I would be, I'm actually about the 50 to 59 age bracket now. I know I don't look it. So, I would be in the, in the last 9%, last 11% of people. So what can we tell about the way our graveyard population lived? Well, pathology, trauma, and disease. These were farmers. And I've got an idea that I'm actually going over time, so I'll go through this a bit quicker. Lots and lots of arthritis and bone degeneration. Farming, these are the poorest of the working people. Farming was hard. We see lots of lipping of bone. We call osteophytes. Lots of problems with the joints. This is a femur ball. This is a ulna, basically the joint of an arm bone, and showing lots of arthritis. This is the distal, so the far end of, I think, a femur. But you can see here, they've had a really bad knock, which has caused a tendon to calcify and form bone. So these people had, if you get to a certain age at Poulton, you're going to see arthritis. You're also going to see breaks. This is a tibia and fibula. And they basically, one nasty break, it's not like going to the hospital now, unless it's a clean break, did that, and it basically healed shorter. So the person would have had a pronounced limp. We get other things, like this gentleman was in the Eastern graveyard, and he had a dislocated hip, and it's difficult to see, but this here is how this poor gentleman walked. He dislocated his hip in life, and it formed a false joint, and he walked with what would have been a severe impediment, but he's probably, from this position in the graveyard, a manly, so he was looked after. We have some skeletons with multiple pathologies, such as osteophytes. This individual skeleton, 166, which is a female, had a broken clavicle, collarbone, which healed shorter. They lost teeth, which sealed over. They had arthritis in their knees. So many of them show multiple pathology of time. We also have from what I understand, is more prevalent in middle-aged females in current society. We also have linear enamel hyperplasia. Now, these are people who are most susceptible to starvation in times of crisis, in times of poor crops. And we see plenty of evidence that the people here went through periodic starvation. And one of the ways is, it can also be severe disease, but more often than not, is starvation. So can you see the line across the teeth here? This is called linear enamel hyperplasia, and it happens when the teeth are forming in the jaw. So this happened to this person in their childhood when the second teeth are forming. And if you are either severely ill or starving, your body will stop all non-essential processes in an attempt to save you. So this person survived. And that also means poor enamel formation. A little by, if you want to age a child, there are dental charts for tooth eruption. Now, I'm quite small. I'm only 5'3" because my mother was a little old small Welsh lady. So the long bones might actually give me as a younger age if I had died as a child. But the dentist is always the one who gives you the good age, because teeth will always erupt within 6 months of when, in a 6-month gap, whether you're starving, whether you're sick, they will always erupt. But in this case, imperfect enamel formation. Also, what happens when you can't go to a dentist with an abscess? That's what happens. And this person could have lived for quite a long time after the abscess ruptured out of the top of their cheek, out of their maxilla. It wouldn't have been pleasant, but after a while, it might not have even hurt them that much. But this person did end up with basically a leaking abscess. We also have other evidence of starvation, and that's cribra orbitalia, small holes and pits in the back of the orbits which suggest iron deficiency. And there are more than one way of it happening, but primarily it's starvation. We also get lots and lots of snail shells at Poulton's medieval layers and pits and ditches, indicating famine food. So these people are going through periodic starvation. Sometimes we see wear due to different practices. On this jaw here, you can see wear over the top two teeth, which may have been from, this is a female, as I understand it, may have been from using some kind of flax or cord on the teeth like this. And for our first time a couple of years ago, it was a reasonably upsetting one. We never forget that we're dealing with human beings. I make sure our students are always respectful, but I will never let them name a skeleton because they had names, they were people. And this is our first in utero burial of an adult female, and the bones of the child are in the pelvic area, in the birth canal. Now, this lady died in her 20s, and she was about 7 months pregnant. She also had spina bifida occulta, which many people have it and don't realize it. We don't know if that's the reason she died, but she died when she was about 7 months pregnant. And this is, again, positioned in the graveyard as probably a manly or somebody related to them. Other things we have evidence of basically rickets, vitamin D deficiency in a couple of our children. Now, vitamin D is something you should get because you're outside, but maybe they were swaddled, maybe they were ill already with something else we can't see on the bones. Although we can see a lot on the bones, more often than not, we can't tell cause of death because whatever kills somebody is usually too quick to affect the bones. But we do have cases of rickets. We also have at least one case of syphilis. It was redeposited bones, so we don't have the complete skeleton. But these are multi molars. So this child, this subadult, actually got syphilis off the mother in the womb, and it causes this kind of like bubbling and cusping of the teeth that we call multimolars. So this child had syphilis. We also get, and this is published again and referenced, and there's a reference at the end, we have multiple cases of Paget's disease of the bone, and that's a thickening of the bone. Now, it's a bone remodeling problem where the body adds bone unevenly, and many people have it, especially in the northwest of England. If you're of a Caucasian background, it seems to be a prevalence of it in this region, and it's been found at Norton Priory as well. And it has an effect very much like brittle bones, and it primarily affects the long bones, the legs, and the head, and it causes this thickening of the bones. So there's plenty of research being done on that as well. We also have unexplained pathology. Now have a gander at this one. Skeleton 705, a male, approximately 21 plus years. Now look at the legs. Now that one's not so bad, but look what's going on here with these bony growths with the knees. There's been much debate over this, and we still do not know what this individual had. It's difficult to see, but basically those are kind of like quite pronounced abnormalities, thickening in, you know, kind of bone growth, and it's in basically the legs and the arms, but it's very, very pronounced here. So that's something we're continuing to research, and that's been sent to the Crick Institute as well. So I know that this is a male, and I know that I think they died between 16 and 1650 AD, so quite possibly a manly as well. Now, that is what is actually a brief talk about the human remains, the assemblage we have at Poulton. And with the 800 minimum number, this is one of the largest, if not the largest, rural remains from a medieval site in England. But the next thing is where is the abbey? Because I've told you lots about the abbey, the chapel, but not about the abbey. The Cistercians had a reverence for water, and they were famous water engineers. And many of you may have been to a Cistercian abbey. I think Dore Abbey in Sheffield, near Sheffield, is one of them. And Valley Crucis in North Wales is another. And there's multiple ones. Tintern is one as well. They're always close to where they can channel water. And you can't channel water up on this field. You just can't do it. They would have had to create such water engineering, we would still be able to see it now. All of the channeling of the water has happened on the floodplain. Now, I'm going to tell you some of the things I know about it or how I know them, but I spent a lot of time studying the Cistercians, and they will almost always found, if they have the chance, a abbey where a brook meets a river, which is just there. But how did I get that? I read everything I could about the Cistercian monks. There is a chance that there's more medieval remains in the chapel area, because in the eastern graveyard, just over here, we found a burial, medieval burial, one of the ones, but actually overlying the remains of a tumbled wall. Now, it might be something to do with the Cistercians, but it could easily be from the Saxon period. It could be from the Roman period. It just means that this burial overlies the tumble of this wall. Oh, right. Now, I did go to Dewlacre Abbey in Leek, which has now been taken down extensively, but is right next to, but they built, in the 19th century, they took the abbey down and they built all the farm buildings around it. So there's bits of the abbey all over the place. And I had a long chat to the farmer, who is a very nice gentleman. This is part of the abbey, part of one of the windows. And you can see it's very similar to this from Poulton. Sorry about the pen as a scale, but this came off the chapel and this came off the abbey at Dewlacre. And I said to the farmer, the monks who built Dewlacre are the monks who built Poulton. So I needed ideas, and that is again on the floodplain, but he said they knew what they were doing because it's never flooded. And so it's again on the floodplain, very close to the river. Now, chapel field, here we go. Here's our water engineering. Now that's artificial, the monks did that. And here is our chapel. Now, I think what's happened is this. When the monks, oh, that's why I do this. Take a look. This is 17th century. Take a look at this boundary here that goes from the brook right the way across the field. Look how close it is, although it's difficult to see. Look how close it is to the tripartite chapel. It goes right up to the actual tripartite chapel, the eastern end. And the later burials cut into what we found was a feature that follows this alignment. And it is actually an old boundary wall with some really, really, really nice big blocks, some really nice big load-bearing blocks. And this was in there as well. Part of a Palestine, kind of like one of those small columns with dogtooth decoration, which I am told is basically from roughly the time of the Cistercians, medieval. It was 1214 when the monks signed the lease to go to Dewlacre, but they didn't lay the foundation down until 1220. No standing remains have ever been recorded at Poulton. I believe that they took the abbey down in that time and they rebuilt or possibly built, but I think rebuilt and utilized a lot of the material in rebuilding the chapel. So the abbey may well have been non-visible from the time the monks left. But there's more than just that. This chapel has only ever produced one very good datable feature from the time of the abbey, and it's a pit, a stone-lined pit, published as well, you'll see at the end, but in the southern graveyard. Now, this is the stone-lined pit. Now, we've actually excavated here for many years, so burials have been excavated and recorded and fill removed from above this feature because it was not originally exposed. This burial cuts into this pit. So the pit's been stone-lined with very old structural building material. This burial's been inserted into it later on. But when we actually removed that, so after we excavated and recorded it, we removed it and there was a charcoal-rich fill underneath it. It produced a lot of fish bone of the type that, herring, especially Atlantic herring, and some local fish. But at the time, in the medieval period, fish were transported in barrels. It produced some metalwork, which dates to roughly the time of the abbey. And it also produced some, but also slightly later. So it's a bit disconcerting. It produced a lot of one pot that definitely dates to the time of the abbey, and the radiocarbon date was AD 1038 to 1203. When you put the pottery finds with it, it would seem to be that this dates to the time of the abbey. So the metalwork is actually from about 50 years later after the abbey left, but there are some problems with the dating, as in the dating of that metalwork is down to a couple of sites and is open to conjecture. I've interpreted this as a feature with the radiocarbon date. It could not have been after the abbey was formed. And the pottery definitely dates to the time of the abbey, but the metalwork throws a bit of a spanner in the works. But I've interpreted it as they need to do more work on that metalwork. Basically, the bits of they found, let me finish, they find some horse, some cattle, and sheep bone in small amounts, and also part of a horseshoe and some other metalwork, a D-shaped buckle, and so forth. That's what it looks like after. But when in doubt, and when you're as religious as a brick like me, best thing to do, go and speak to the Cistercians. So I went, and they were very nice to live with the Cistercians for 9 days. And I've cultivated a relationship with them, although I'm an atheist myself, and because my parents are pretty much atheists, they got me Christian Protestant. I did grow up in Merseyside, so I grew up very, very closely to Catholicism. So I did have an understanding of it. And I went to live with the monks, and they put me up for 9 days, knowing that I wasn't religious, very, very kindly, in Mount St. Bernard's Abbey, the only Cistercian abbey left in England. It's actually founded in the 19th century. No Cistercian abbey survived the dissolution. And I made friends with Father Terry, and Father Terry is a great gentleman. Most of the monks who are at Mount St. Bernard's are from different, from Germany or from Africa. Apart from their archivist, Father Terry, who's from St. Helens. So he is a woolly back like me, and we got on great together. Now, reading can only take you so far. And I wanted to live the life of somebody, I wanted to understand the Cistercians and understand Catholicism. So I was there for the 7 or 8 services they did every day from 3:30 onwards in the morning. And it was actually really humbling experience to do. And Father Terry and I have worked together. I knew a lot of what he told me from books, but to get his thought process has allowed us to refine where we think the abbey is in its life. Now, before we do that, what would happen is when the monks were first offered some land, they just wouldn't take it automatically. The monks would go out for, say the Abbey of Dewlacre, or not the Abbey of Dewlacre, the Abbey of Cumbermere was offered land at Poulton. They wouldn't just take it. They would send out representatives. And, this is just what we need. Thank you. Just what in a barren area. If it wasn't actually barren, they'd make it barren by dispossessing the population and sending them off to live in the city. And then they wouldn't build the abbey straight away. There was actually in the rule of St. Benedict a set of rules for what was needed. They needed a place to worship, a place to live. They'd need also a set of books, and I think they'd need a guest area, and they'd need a certain amount of minimum things. When they go to live there, they then set about making the land prosperous. And making the land prosperous might be, the water engineering, the cultivation, the taking down woodland and forest, draining areas, and that might take 10 or 15 years. And they would need a temporary place of worship. And in the case of Mount St. Bernard's, for the first 10 years, that was basically a farmhouse at the top of the hill in the 19th century, that when they were ready, they actually started to build the abbey, and they turned that into an orphan boys' home. Father Terry and I now both have come to the conclusion that the medieval chapel was actually a standing secular building that was in a very prominent position and was an ideal location for them to turn it, to Christianize it and make it their temporary church while they're doing the landscape, maybe 10 or 15 years of actually cultivating and doing all that water engineering. They're very rich very quickly, so they wouldn't have stayed there for the whole 65 years. But when they decide, they then go to build the abbey, and whether, of course, it's built in stone immediately or wood immediately or parts of stone or parts of wood is the big question, the million-dollar question. But when they decide to leave, they have an already consecrated area which can form a building, which can form the chapel for the local populace who are now farming the land from after they've left. Whether this was the original populace, or they brought in a new population, or it was a smaller population that had not been dispossessed who lived on the outskirts, is another thing. But our chapel is probably the first Cistercian church, not the abbey, but the first place they worshipped. And it's probably on the floodplain, almost definitely. We've been doing magnetometry survey. It's quick, it's good, it's reliable, works great on a floodplain. Our first one, these are the places I actually don't think it is, but I thought there's a chance. This one is at a bend in the river, but it was slightly too far away from where all of the engineering was. But we did a magnetometry survey. We found medieval ridge and furrow. We chose this because of its position and because it didn't flood when everywhere else floods. But absolutely nothing there apart from medieval ridge and furrow and an old medieval lane. We then chose a place to the west of it. I know you can't see it on the map, but this is on the floodplain. It did show us evidence of earthworks and pits, possibly of medieval origin, but certainly not an abbey. We went to another field. This is just to the west, so this is actually the fish ponds, in the hope of finding some evidence. We found old field boundaries, fires, lots more pits. We didn't find an abbey. And we went into this big calving field immediately to the west of that. Now, this field is adjacent to a field called Clousters Field, which is cloisters. And because of its unusual shape and its position next to the original brook, you can't see it here, but the brook has been canalized and diverted in the 8th century. We were hoping it was going to be in this field. We found more pits, more ridge and furrow, some possible archaeological natural features. We still haven't found it. But the bit I can't tell you is, I'm pretty sure I have found it. I'll tell you about that one when we surveyed that field and when we published it. Until then, I can't give the location away. But that's pretty much my talk. I hope this is the first time I have talked solely on the medieval, and I hope I've made it interesting. I hope I've made it legible, and I hope I've made it basically coherent, legible, coherent. But there are some acknowledgements. We couldn't dig and excavate and research such a vital and well-preserved area without the permission and the blessing and the support of the Fair family. Also the Poulton Trust, the Poulton volunteers who come rain and shine, the Eton Estate who have been wonderful to us over the years, Liverpool John Moores University staff, researchers and students who do so much work. We've had so many publications and so many more coming out. A lot of the questions you might have relate to work that is currently being done and written up. I've already got one publication in review. I've got plans for another 2 to 3 on the medieval graveyard assemblage in concert with academics from Liverpool John Moores University. There's the Crick Institute research, which is being done. People are doing PhDs now as we speak in John Moores. And there's a lot going on, a lot of exciting work. Also, I'd like to thank the Glyndŵr University in Wrexham and the University of Liverpool, who both have smaller elements of the human remains collection for teaching, and it's housed there. They use it as a teaching tool, and they do some research, but our students go out and research the material there as well. This is just a few of our publications on Poulton. An early one, the Archaeology of an Ecclesiastical Landscape, gives a lot of good history. It's way back in 1996, not 5, sorry about that, but it gives a lot of the basically historical research. There's one of 2 or 3 publications here on Paget's disease of the bone. There's my very small article that I did on the pit, time capsule of a time capsule. There's also the blood is thicker than baptismal water in the International Journal of Osteoarchaeology. is the one on the small baby burial in the box. And I did a kind of one I like to send to my students, which is a 5-page article, so to speak, in Current Archaeology magazine. Really did well, but there's other stuff as well. You can always look on my Academia ADU profile, Kevin Cootes, Cootes. That's got more publications on the prehistoric, on the Roman, especially the Iron Age. If you like your Iron Age, and we do have human remains from the Iron Age, only a few scraps, but we are the only site in northwest England and parts of North Wales and that has Iron Age human remains, possibly one fragment of a burial of a baby and scraps of human remains. But it's been thoroughly, it's been lovely to speak to you, lovely to present. I hope you didn't laugh at my jokes too much, but now I welcome any questions and thank you for coming to listen to me speak. I'm going to stop share now, okay?
Great, well, thank you, Kevin. So, sorry, you're back again. I'm back again. Thank you very much for that extremely comprehensive talk. I mean, there was an awful lot to cover, and you really gave us a good oversight of everything there. And I could probably spend the next 20 to 30 minutes asking you questions. We've had lots of positive feedback. I think, Rob, is there time for just one question? Because we have gone over just by a minute or two. But I'm sure we can give Kevin just a quick question.
There were. So a couple of questions actually about any remains that correlates to the period of the Black Death, and if you had any more information to share on that specifically.
Black Death, the several visitations of the plague, which I think I remember is 1348 to 1349 in the first Black Death, and then it goes through several centuries. The Black Death doesn't leave any markings on the bone. The Crick Institute study is the first opportunity we've had to look for the Black Death, and I can't tell you if we found it or not. But what I can tell you is, there was Black Death in Chester, the bubonic and pneumonic, the plagues, bubonic and pneumonic plagues, and it was in Chester. So without the Crick Institute study, I would expect it to be at Poulton as well. I cannot tell you either way, even though I actually know, because it's somebody else's research. But what I can tell you, there's no sign of it in the bones, but there was the plague at Chester, and we are in the time of the plague. That's the best I can answer. I'm sorry. I'm happy to answer as many questions as you like. By the way, it's up to you guys and time.
Okay. Well, quite a lot of the questions that came in early on were answered throughout the talk already. So I'm going to hand back to you.
Okay. Actually, quick question, Kevin. Is the Poulton project still running? Isn't it? The excavation side.
Yes, it is.
So,
sorry, go on.
So people can come and take part in the project, can they not? Or is it just for local people? No,
it's an interesting that we run field schools. They are all fully subscribed this year. We train Liverpool John Moores University students on the graveyard, and also South Connecticut State University students come, and we have students from Nottingham University as well. At the moment, our field schools are concentrating on the prehistoric and Roman archaeology. There is a hell of a lot there. It's a whole landscape. And as much as the medieval chapel is very, very important, the Iron Age and the Romano British kind of rewriting everything, but we give equal weight to everything. So the human remains that are being dug are primarily dug by Liverpool John Moores University as part of this field school. I also have a hell of a lot of publications to get out on the graveyard. So we don't want to keep excavating too many skeletons while I have so much work to do. So yes, you can come and volunteer as well. We have Saturday morning volunteer sessions that you have to contact the Poulton Research Project and ask if there's, one, it's good that you can drive. There's Saturday mornings. You can't, my volunteers do work on the graveyard, but not to excavate the burials, to often uncover them, to work on the site. More often than not, they work on the Iron Age and Roman, whatever we need them to do, but they do work in first-class archaeology. So if you wanted to volunteer on a Saturday morning, we do have a website, Poulton Research Project. We've got a Twitter site, @Poulton Project, and we have a Facebook site, Poulton Research Project. You can send messages if you want to volunteer, and what will happen is they will probably come through to me, and I will send them on to Paul, our volunteer coordinator, and he will contact you. My suggestion is we do basically accept, it's a volunteer thing, so we accept, basically, if you can walk around the field, is a decent amount of mobility is required. It's a half a mile walk around the field, and there's a lot of kneeling and a lot of lifting. But I started as a volunteer 21 years ago, 22 years ago. God, yeah. So I hope that answers the question.
So, well, to anyone who's watching, you could be the next Kevin. Get in touch with him. Right. Okay. I am going to draw it to a close. Thank you very much, Kevin, for that talk, which is hugely enjoyable. Just before we go, I will just let people know that our next talk is on Tuesday, the 2nd of May, and we have Harold Mighton and Anna Fairley talking about the Catholic experience of the 19th century burial crisis rather than a medieval burial crisis. So please do join us again on the 2nd of May. But otherwise, thank you again, Kevin, and thank you all for tuning in, and we'll hopefully see you next month.
Thank you. Bye.